Okay. Parshas Ray. Now in Perek Yudalid, the Torah says there, discusses the halachas of what animals are kosher to eat, and what animals you're not allowed to eat, and then the Torah says, and toward the end, in discussing what the animals, what a person is allowed to eat and what a person is not allowed to eat. So the Torah says that lo stochlu kol nevela ager shebeshrechtem v'chala mochel mavi ki am kodesh atah Hashem lekecha. So the Torah says that you cannot eat the animal that didn't have shechita. You have to give it to the ger, the nevela, because you're a holy people. And then it concludes, lo sabashel di b'chalei vimo. Do not cook a di. Now, di usually means a kid goat, but lo sabashel di b'chalei vimo, do not cook a kid goat in the milk of its mother. Now the Rambam. So this is the law of bas b'chalav. Now the prohibition of bas b'chalav, it doesn't apply just to a kid goat. It applies to all animals, all kosher animals, and it could be a shore, it could be a cow, but there is a prohibition. There's a prohibition of cooking the meat of any of the kosher animals, together with milk, a biblical prohibition to cook it together with milk, but D is given as an example, and the Rambam says, why is D a kid? Given an example, and it doesn't have to be the milk of the mother. It could be anyone's milk, any milk of any animal milk. So he says, why is it? Because lo nemar di b'chalei vimo ela shediber hakosef b'hoveh. Why did the Torah talk about D, only about D, when it applies to all kosher animals, and it applies to the milk of all kosher animals, cooking them together? So it says, Eladibra haTorah b'lashon hoveh. The Torah was talking in the present tense, but the law itself applies to all kosher animals and to all kosher milk, cooking them together. Now, it's well known that the prohibition, even though the Torah phrases it in terms of cooking, the prohibition of cooking it, but it's not, the biblical prohibition is not just in terms of cooking, but you're not allowed to you're not allowed to eat it, and you're not allowed to derive benefit from it either. This is the halacha of bas b'chalav, milk and meat. You can't cook it. You can't eat it, and you can't derive benefit. Now, the laws of eating in general, most of the prohibitions of eating, things that were considered kosher versus non-kosher, applies to eating. We don't find the law prohibiting it from being from the act of cooking. We don't find certainly a biblical law and even a rabbinic law to prohibit the actual cooking. However, when it comes to milk and meat together. So the Torah not only prohibits milk and meat that was cooked together from eating, but you're not allowed to cook it either. And also, you're not allowed to derive benefit from it. And most of the prohibitions of non-kosher focus only on the prohibition, certainly the biblical prohibition of not eating. So basar v'chalav is unique. On one hand, it's prohibited in eating. On the other hand, you're not allowed to cook it. The one who cooks the milk and meat together, even though he's not going to be the one to eat it, somebody else will eat it. But nevertheless, the one who cooked it is also in violation of the prohibition. A matter of fact, the expression in the Torah doesn't talk explicitly about eating. It talks about bishul. Lo sebashel di b'chalei vimo. Do not cook a kid animal, a kid goat, in the milk of its mother. But that prohibition applies. That prohibition applies not just to cooking, but to eating. The Rambam says it's a kal v'chomer. If cooking it is prohibited, so certainly eating it is prohibited. And the Gemara in Chulin tells us it's mentioned 3 times. The prohibition of lo sabashel bi b'chalei vimo is mentioned 3 times in the Torah, twice in Chumash Shmos and once here in Parshas Rabbi. And why is it mentioned 3 times? So the Gemara in Chulin says it's mentioned 3 times to tell me that biblically it's prohibited in cooking, it's prohibited in eating, and it's prohibited in deriving benefit from it. So the Isur of bishul basar v'chalav, it applies to all 3. And also, even though the Torah specifies di and chalei vimo and the milk of its mother, even though the Torah specifies this thing, kid, okay, kid does not necessarily have to mean kid goat, although generally it does, but it could have reference to other animals as well. But all animals are prohibited and doesn't have to be cooked in the milk of the mother either. So the question is, why is it? We have a number of questions. One question is, why does the Torah tell us about the prohibition of lo savashel di b'chalei vimo in terms of bishul basar v'chalav? And for that matter, why did the Torah prohibit cooking? No other food that is prohibited does it focus on the prohibition of cooking. The laws of kashrus, for the most part, don't apply to cooking. It applies to eating. So why does the Torah, by basar v'chalav, by milk and meat, the Torah, it not only is cooking prohibited, but in telling us the whole prohibition of milk and meat together, the Torah phrases it in the terminology of cooking milk and meat. Now, it's true, on a biblical level, milk and meat is only prohibited if the milk and meat is cooked together. That's true. But nevertheless, the prohibition is a prohibition of eating also. A matter of fact, if you take a look at Targum Onkelos, even though the Torah tells us, lo sabashel di b'chalei vimo, do not cook a kid, goat, whatever, in the milk of its mother. The Targum Onkelos translates it here. He says, lo seichlun, you shall not eat. And in Shemos also a similar expression that has reference to eating. The Torah prohibits the eating of basar v'chalav. And when the Targum Onkelos translates it, he doesn't even translate in terms of the cooking, but in terms of the eating. So why does the Torah focus on the cooking as opposed to the words that would indicate about eating? That's one question that we have to address. And then the question is, and this question was raised by the Rambam, since it applies to all kinds of animals, and the milk, and any milk, it doesn't have to be the milk of the mother of the animal whose meat you're cooking. Why does the Torah phrase it in terms of you shall not cook a kid goat in the milk of its mother? Why does the Torah phrase it? Why does the Torah phrase it that way? Now, there is a very interesting Rambam. The Rambam in the Moreh Nevuchim, the Rambam Moreh Nevuchim tries. He is in the third section of Moreh Nevuchim. He gives tamim. He gives reasons for many of the mitzvahs of the Torah. Now, the Rambam had a certain perspective. In general, his perspective was that many of the mitzvahs of the Torah, as they're written in the Torah, is to wean the Jew from idolatry. In other words, the nations of the world at the time of the giving of the Torah, and certainly at the time of Avraham Avinu, the Rambam seems to, in explaining the mitzvahs of the Torah, seems to have been very much influenced by the practices of the nations of the world in the time of Avraham Avinu, as well as in the time of the giving of the Torah. So the purpose is to wean the Jew, or to keep the Jew away from idolatry, from avodah zarah. And the Torah made certain mitzvos, according to the way the Rambam describes it in Sefer Mitzvos, to prohibit practices that, although might not have been idolatry in itself, but was associated with the idolatry. For example, the Rambam says that kalayim, mixing of seeds that is prohibited in growing things of different the grapes together with other things. So that was a practice that was as identified with idolatry. That's why the Torah prohibited it. And the Rambam mentions shatnez. Why did the Torah prohibit shatnez? Because shatnez, wool and linen together, the Rambam says, was identified with the clothes that the priests wore. Now it's interesting because the Kohen Gadol had some shatnez also, but it seems that things associated with the Beis Hamikdash, there was less of a concern of that it would lead the people to idolatry. So Orla also has to do the first 3 years that a tree grows, according to the Rambam, is associated also with idolatry because of the practices that the nations of the world would eat those fruits as part of an idolatrous ritual. So, and the most famous is korbanos, and there it's interesting. When it comes to korbanos, the giving sacrifices, the Rambam explains the giving of sacrifices on the basis of that time there was a drive. There was a drive in man to give korbanos. And there was a fear that if the Torah did not provide for the mitzvah of karbanos, for a mitzvah of karbanos. So that drive in man would not have been filled. And that would have led them to idolatry, which focused very much on the idea of giving animal sacrifices. So consequently, the Torah had mitzvos of giving sacrifices in the temple in the Beis HaMikdash. But the Torah, in saying that we should give sacrifices in the Beis HaMikdash, it wasn't the animals that, for the most part, that the other nations gave as sacrifices. But on the contrary, the emphasis was to sacrifice those type of animals that were worshipped by ancient nations, almost expressive of the idea that our sages tell us in Egypt. The Jews defiantly, before they left Egypt, they took the sheep, the lamb, and they slaughtered it in the eyes of the Egyptians. It wasn't just to show the Egyptians, but it was to show themselves that they're able to negate what was considered holy by their former masters and to do it in front of them. It was, to a certain degree, a demonstration of freedom. Freedom from Egypt, freedom from the ritual of Egypt, and freedom from idolatry. So the Rambam Shita in general, when he tries to explain the mitzvahs of the Torah, he explains it, many of them, not all, but many of the mitzvahs of the Torah, he explains as having been given in a form to wean the Jews from Avodah Zarah. And the Rambam actually said that he was not aware of any ritual among the idolatrous nations, ancient idolatrous nations, that had cooking meat and milk as part of its ritual. However, his theory was, the Rambam said, and I was told by people that there has been some evidence to this. The theory of the Rambam was that there was a ritual among some of the ancient nations on their holidays when they came gathered together to celebrate their idolatrous holidays, to take a kid goat and cook it in the milk of its mother. That was part of the ritual. And that's the reason why the Torah prohibited. Now, we all know that Basar B'Chalav is not limited to the cases where a kid goat is being cooked in the milk of its mother. The prohibition of milk and meat, the biblical prohibition, is even where the milk and meat is the biblical prohibition is even where the milk and meat, it's not the milk of the mother, so long as it's meat from a kosher animal and milk from a kosher animal. So the question is, how are we to understand this Rambam? The Rambam seems to be very difficult. Okay, when you give Tamei mitzvos, when you give reasons for the mitzvos, so the reasons don't always apply. But here, the general prohibition of Basar B'Chalav almost never manifests itself in the situation of the reason. So why is it that the Torah phrased the prohibition of basar b'chalav in terms of a prohibition of doing the ritual that existed among the nations of the world at the time, in the time of the Yavos and at the time of Matan Torah, at the time of the giving of the Torah? Now, I think we have to understand the Rambam's attitude to Tamei mitzvos. The Rambam seems to draw a border, a separation between the halacha, the practice of halacha, and the mitzvah, and the way the halacha is phrased in the Torah. Now, what do I mean by that? Many years ago, the Lubavitcher Rebbe published a certain piece of Torah. Honestly, I don't even know what it was, and it had to do, I was told, about a pasuk that Chazal, that our sages, as with most psukim and most mitzvos, they give details that are not included and sometimes even seem to be not in consonance with the way the Torah is written. Similar to the case of basar b'chalav. There it wasn't basar b'chalav though. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe asked a certain question against the simple wording of the way the prohibition was written down. And according to the way our sages explained that pasuk, there was no question. But from the simple reading of the pasuk, without the halachas that were added, there was a certain question that arose. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe tried to explain the pasuk, lefi pshuto, and to remove some of those questions that existed. And he was attacked because people question, if Chazal tell us, if our sages tell us that the halacha is not in accordance with the literal translation of the pasuk. So how can you ask a question against the literal translation of the pasuk? In Tanakh we find very often, you look at the Gemara and Megillah, in the Nevi'im, and in the Nevi'im we find very often that many words were left out of the Nevi'im. It was written in a non-complete way. The Gemara at the beginning of Megillah talks about such psukim. It mentions there that Yonasan ben Uziel sometimes added words that for one reason or another were not included in the Nevi'im. My sense is, if I was to explain the idea, Reb Chaim once said, what was the status of the Nevi'im? After all, the Nevi'im, to a certain degree, was given to Moshe at Sinai. However, we are to understand that. So, what was Reb Chaim asked? What was the status of those if people did receive through Moshe some aspects of the Nevi'im that were given before the Nevi'im were actually put into writing? What was the halachic status of the Nevi'im beforehand? And I heard from my father that Reb Chaim said that beforehand it was considered like Torah Shabbal Peh. It was considered like the oral Torah until it was put into writing. The Nevi'im, as it was given to Moshe Rabbeinu, until the Nevi'im themselves put it into writing, was considered as part of the oral tradition. So since the Nevi'im were identified as part of the oral tradition, we could suggest to retain that status. To retain that status, the Nevi'im, many words were left out. And it was only Yonasan ben Uziel who revealed many of those words in order to emphasize that the Nevi'im was originally given as Torah Shabbal Peh, as part of the oral Torah. And the truth of the matter is, when you take a look at, even if you take a look at the Mishnah, very often we say in the Gemara, there are many words lacking in the Mishnah. And this is what should be read or said or written or learned. Why? Because at the time the Mishnah was put into writing, in the time a text was created for the Mishnah, there was still a prohibition of Torah Shabbal Peh, of putting the oral writing into a text that was learned. But because of the necessity of having a text, the Chachamim had the power, depending how they evaluated the situation, to say that we could make a text, but in order to emphasize that the prohibition of putting other things into writing as a text to be learned in public. So the Mishnah very often has things that are missing, and the Gemara comes and tells us what's missing from the Mishnah. So it could be that these those who were critical of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, they perhaps felt that this should be the approach used in regard to the Chumash as well. In other words, when we learn the Chumash, not obviously when we read it, but when we learn the Chumash, it's almost like we have to consider the Chumash as if all the things our sages tell us about those laws were as if they were written in the Torah. And if that be the case, their feeling was, that a question shouldn't be asked. The truth is that even if we assume that, and we say it's not something that was limited to the Nevi'im, which I have trouble with, but even if we say that, it would still be a question. So what's the idea? And I think the idea that Lubavitcher Rebbe wanted to say was actually the idea, this was the perspective of the Rambam. The Rambam felt that there is Torah Shebechsav and there is Torah Shabbal Peh. And when it comes to practice, chas v'shalom, even to ignore one word that our sages say will make you an apikoros. But the Torah was written in a certain way, sometimes leaving out some of the halachas or many of the halachas of the Torah Shabbal Peh, because there is something to be learned from the Torah Shebechsav in the way the Torah Shebechsav was given as the Torah Shebechsav. It's very interesting. I mean, the Beis Halevi says. Beis Halevi says that because the Medrash says that if the Jewish people hadn't sinned with the luchos, but hadn't sinned with the Egel Azav at the time of the giving of the luchos, there would not have been a Torah Shabbat pad, would not have been an oral tradition. But the Beis Halevi says it doesn't mean that the halachas wouldn't apply, but many of those halachas would have been written in to the Torah Shabbat, would have been written into the Torah Shabbat. And probably those who were critical of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, they understood that to mean that we cannot learn the Torah Shebechsav by itself on any level, independent of the Torah Shabbat Peh. Of course, when it comes to halacha, it's that way. And many are actually very critical. Many are critical of Doli Harishonim, the Rashbam, because the Rashbam explains the Torah Shebechsav in a very literal fashion. Now, it's not Chas v'Shalom that the Rashbam, who was the leader of the Chachmei Ashkenaz, after the time of his grandfather Rashi, the Rashbam and Rabbeinu Tam, that he Chas v'Shalom would ignore the Torah Shabbat Peh. But the Rashbam, like the Rambam, felt that psukim of the Torah, the way they're written, even though halacha l'maaseh in terms of the halacha, they don't have application, but there is a message contained in them. And let me point out where we see this in the Rambam. And the same is true with the Ibn Ezra. It's not that the Ibn Ezra, on the contrary, you see how often the Ibn Ezra attacks the Karayim. He calls them all kinds of names. But he saw his tachlis, he saw his purpose, as the Rashbam saw his purpose, to explain the Torah shebechsav in a literal fashion. And when there seems to be contradictions between the Torah shebechsav and the Torah Shabbat Peh, either we have to find the way to answer the contradictions or try to find out what is the lesson that the Torah Shebechsav is trying to tell us. And the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim, when he discusses the halacha of ayin tachas ayin, that an eye for an eye, that if someone injures his fellow, he injures somebody else, so his punishment is that he gets, we apply to him the same injury that he gave to somebody else. He knocks out somebody's eye, his eye, according to the Torah Shebechsav, is knocked out. But our sages tell us that we can't take it literally. And the Rambam says they learned this was given over because, Shel Shmuel ad Moshe Rabbeinu, this is the way it was given over in Sinai. The Rambam says, what is the reason for ayin tachas ayin? An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. What is the reason for this? The Rambam says because a person who was so negligent and he knocked out the eye of his friend deserves to have his eye put out. And then the Rambam asks a question, and if you'll ask me, but our sages say we can't take this literally. But it means mammon, that you have to pay him for the value of the eye. And there's all kinds of discussions how it's evaluated. He says the purpose of this chibur, the purpose of this book, meaning the Moreh Nevuchim, is to explain the Torah in its literal fashion. But the Rambam is very clear that anybody who rejects that ayin tachas ayin is mamon, anybody who rejects that was what we were told at Har Sinai, he's an apikoros. He's a heretic. So on one hand, he says the purpose of his book, the purpose of the Moreh Nevuchim is to explain the Torah literally. On the other hand, he says those who follow the Torah literally are heretics. How are we to resolve these two opposite attitudes? The Rambam says we resolve these two. The Rambam says, well, the Rambam doesn't say, but the simple explanation is that it's true. Halacha, if someone rejects the halacha, he's an apikoros. If he rejects the Torah Shabbal Peh, he is a heretic. Rejects the oral law, he rejects the oral tradition. And even if he accepts it, but denies its origin, he's a heretic. But nevertheless, there is a message there. And the message is that a person who injures somebody else really deserves to be injured. But the Torah had rachmanis on him. And the Torah said, pay money instead. But a person who injures somebody very often, perhaps most of the time, it was because it was somebody else. If it was himself, he would have been more careful. He would be more sensitive. It shows that he wasn't able to have the feelings the concern that he has for himself, to have for the other person. So there is a lesson. That's why the Rambam explains it. The Rambam held that, yes, we follow the halacha of the Torah Shabbal Peh, the oral law. But nevertheless, the way it's written, there is a message also. And I think that's what the Rambam is telling us by Basa B'Cholav, that don't cook a di in the milk of its mother. Why? The Rambam says, because he says, when you look at the psukim, 2 of the 3 times that the prohibition of lo sabashel di b'chalei vimo, do not cook a di in the milk of its mother, 2 of the 3 times that it's mentioned, the 2 times it's mentioned in Chumash Shmos, it's talking right next to psukim dealing with Aliyah L'Regel. It's talking about psukim, about verses in the Torah that talk about our requirement on the holidays to go to Jerusalem to be Ola L'Regel. The Rambam says it's his theory that the nations of the world, when they celebrated their holidays, their idolatrous holidays, and they gathered together, they had a ritual of cooking a kid, and perhaps a kid goat, in the milk of its mother. So the Torah, in phrasing the prohibition of milk and meat, it talked about it in the ritualistic terms. And the ritual was cooking it. Obviously, they ate it afterwards also. So that's why so he says that's why the Torah mentions the prohibition of milk and meat. But we could understand the Rambam says Diber HaTorah. Why does the Torah talk about D? Why does the Torah talk about cooking a kid goat? A kid applies to all kosher animals. So the Rambam says Diber HaTorah b'lashon hoveh. The Torah talked in terms of the present. What was the present? What was the present? At the time, present means in the time of Matan Torah. What was the present situation? So the Preisha, in his commentary on the Torah, the Preisha says that in those days, people, you didn't go buy milk in the store. You didn't even have milkmen selling milk. But people had their own animals, and that's how they got their milk. And what was common, it wasn't that common for everybody to have a cow. But what they had was goats. And so lo sabashal di b'chalei vimo. So goats was something that was very, very accessible. And because of that, the Torah phrased the prohibition in terms of what was very easily accessible. Milk and goats, the milk of goats and the goats, they had that in their barn, they had that by their houses. So the Torah phrased the prohibition in those terms, but the prohibition applied to all kosher meat and all meat from kosher animals and all milk from kosher animals, irregardless. That's how I want to suggest something altogether different based on what I just said. I want to suggest that when he said Diber HaTorah b'lashon hoveh, when he said Diber HaTorah b'lashon hoveh, he is talking about the practices of that day. In that day, there was a ritual practice, as the Rambam says in Moreh Nevuchim. There was a ritual practice of cooking milk, the milk of the goat with the kid goat. So in telling us about the prohibition, the Torah told it to us in terms of the time, in terms of the practice that existed in those days, not so much by the Jews, but by the nations of the world. And there was a great fear, you see, throughout the Sedras, that there was a great fear that the Jewish people will adapt, and that happened, the practices of the nations of the world. So consequently, the Torah said, in telling us about the prohibition of milk and meat, the Torah said, Lo sabashu di b'chalei vimo. And it's interesting, we could suggest, and Rabbi Chaim felt that when the Torah when the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim gives a reason for a mitzvah, it's not that he's giving a reason for the mitzvah. We don't know the reasons that God had. But very often when the mitzvah of the Torah conforms to the proper way of living, God created the world or allowed the world to come in such a way that the observance of Torah and mitzvos will eliminate the possibility of falling into bad circumstances. The Rambam explains some of the mitzvos of kashrus on the basis of health. Rabbi Chaim says it's not because of health concerns that God gave what animals you can eat and what animals you cannot eat. But the reason, but just on the contrary, it was the Rambam's feeling, Rabbi Chaim said, that those animals, the Torah, God, it says, God looked figuratively in the Torah when he created the world. He created the world in such a way that the observance of Torah should be conducive to a proper way of life and overcoming the pitfalls of nature and, to a certain degree, of the nature of life that people adopted that should not have been adopted. So the idea bas b'cholav is phrased here, tells, but it's very strange because we have to understand by the other prohibitions, we understand it more so. Because korbanos, kalayim, shatnez, we shouldn't identify with the nations of the world. But by Bas B'cholav, it seems a little bit more difficult. I think that by Bas B'cholav, by the prohibition of Bas B'cholav, there is a moral lesson, a religious moral lesson that we should learn. And that lesson is what is emphasized over and over in these Sedrus and Barim. Don't look at the nations of the world. Don't try to learn from their practices. In Perek Yud Beis, in this week's Sedra, Pasuk Chav Tes, Torah says, "Ki yachres Hashem l'kefches hagayim asher ba shama l'reshes osaf." When you will take possession of the lands of Canaan, and you will cut down the nations that are there. So beware for yourself, lest you be attracted after them, and after they have been destroyed before you, unless you seek out their God, and lest be careful that because that would lead you to worship their gods. And how did these nations? You search out to find out how these nations worship their gods. So there's a special prohibition that after we're victorious in capturing the land of Israel from the Canaanites, there's a special prohibition that not to follow their ways. Don't be attracted to what they say, do. And to destroy their temples and all that. And what is the reason for this? So what is the reason? What is the reason? The reason, according to the Ramban, we're not allowed, not just because Rashi says, because it'll lead us to worship their idolatry. The Ramban says that there is another prohibition, another reason also, and that is that we shouldn't look to the nations of the world in order to find ways to observe the Torah. In other words, there is a fear. There's a great fear that maybe we will try to mold our observance of our holidays. And this is not just limited to holidays. In all areas, maybe we will try to mold our perspective of ritual, our perspective of the way of living, morally, on the perspective of the nations of the world. It's not just a question that we will bow down to idols, although that is a concern, or to share their religion. But there is a concern, perhaps even, and to a certain degree, even greater concern. We will try to mold Judaism along the lines of their religion. The early Reform movement when they built their temples, the temples were very much built in accordance with the style of the churches of their day. The early Reformed rabbis, and unfortunately, there were probably some, and I'm not finding fault with them, some rabbis in the beginning of our generation, when I was much younger, and perhaps before that adopted some of the clothing that the priests had, the robes that the priest had. That's trying to imitate. And it's very interesting when the Torah tells us not to watch or observe the avodah zarah, the idolatry, the idolatry of the other nations. So the Torah tells us immediately, "Es kol hadavar asher anochi mitzaves chem osu tishmu lasos lo sosifo lo v'lo sigra mimeno." Don't add to the Torah and don't subtract from the Torah. So immediately after telling me about the immediately after telling me about the immediately after telling me about the prohibition of following, of being impressed with the nations of the world, and to pentidrosh, to find out how they observe their religion. So, and that I should do likewise. In other words, according to Ramban, do like they do. The Torah says, "Lo sosipo lo sigra mimenu." Do not add to the Torah, do not subtract from it. In other words, there are times when, on the basis of the influence of the practices of the nations of the world, people might add to the Torah to do things that they do. And at times, and sometimes it could be the exact same thing, lo sigra mimenu. That's not their practice, we're not going to do it either. I saw recently a Reform rabbi. She suggested that the Hanukkah celebration be between Christmas and New Year's. It's 8 days. And perhaps that's the reason the nations of the world adopted an 8-day period. But no, they feel that it's important for us to conform to the schedule of the nations of the world. And so what it's going to be is, we're going to join Hanukkah, Chas v'Sholom, together with Christmas. The truth is that Hanukkah was, on the contrary, used as to separate the Jew, was used to separate the Jew from the celebration. There is, when Jews go walk on the streets in the end of December, they become so impressed. So we have to look at our own thing. That wasn't the reason Hanukkah was instituted. Obviously, Hanukkah was instituted beforehand, but Hanukkah has served to keep us away from these things. And now They're coming out that on the contrary. And there are those that want to have mutual celebrations. When I was a boy, they used to talk about Hanukkah bushes. So the Lososif Olav Losigra Mimenu, when the Torah tells us that we shouldn't focus on the practices of the nations of the world. Perhaps the reason it mentions there, perhaps the reason it mentions that there is because there is always that danger that we, as the Ramban says, that we will try to imitate them. And that could end up in adding ritual, detracting from the ritual of the nation, from the Torah. Now, so I think that's the lesson. Why did the Torah phrase the prohibition of basa b'chalav, the prohibition of milk and meat, in terms of the practices of the nations of the world at the time, at that time? In other words, of celebrating, is because besides the prohibition of basa b'chalav, the Torah wanted to emphasize to us the significance of being on guard, not to celebrate our holidays the way they celebrate. And holidays presents the greatest test of all. Holidays presents, especially when the two holidays come at the same time. So we have to be on special guard. We have our religion, they have their religion. And we have no interest, and we don't want that, and we're not interested in learning about their religion. And the truth is, the less that they know about our religion, the better off we will be. And I could add, the more peace there would be between the two peoples, if the more separate we are when we deal with ritual and religion. Okay.
Please put questions in the chat. Why do we allow material gift giving during Hanukkah like Christmas rather than only giving money?
Okay, it seems that clearly the Gemara at the end of Psachim says that you buy gifts before a yontif for your wife. You buy certain things for your children. You buy other things. You give them certain types of food, whatever it was. That was what they were interested in. So the giving of the gifts is, according to many opinions, there is a mitzvah of simcha. The opinion of the Rambam is that in Hanukkah there is a mitzvah of simcha, of joy. So some of the halachos, it might not be a requirement, but there is certainly a fulfillment of the mitzvah of simcha on Hanukkah. So since there's a fulfillment, we say halal on Hanukkah. According to many shittas, halal is based on simcha. Not only that, if you take a look at the Maseches Sofrim says Yemei Simcha V'Halal, which is the words of the Rambam. So certainly, according to many opinions, there is a mitzvah of simcha. So where there is a mitzvah of simcha, a holiday that there is a mitzvah of simcha, so one should give gifts to kids and to whoever to have simcha, to promote simcha.
How is ayin tachas ayin interpreted if there's emotional or psychological damage that's not physical?
Okay, it's something to look into. That's a big question I would have to look into. You're talking are you talking a one-time incident, or well, certainly Medina Shemayim, I think there would be a mitzvah in helping the person recuperate or overcome that problem. But I don't know that that would play a role without looking into the question in terms of requiring somebody to pay. Today psychologists say that everybody has psychological issues, and of course the ones that they blame is their parents or their this or their that, so everybody is going to go to court against their parents. I mean, it's opening a Pandora's box, because there's hardly a person that one encounters that one couldn't say, oh, I'm suffering psychologically because of him. And there's hardly a case that you wouldn't be able to get a psychiatrist to agree that he's suffering psychologically because of the parent or whoever it is.
Are we allowed to participate in government multi-religion prayer, like an opening prayer in Congress?
I think in Congress, if it was necessary, so not pray. If, in other words, one will have a rabbi offer an opening prayer, priest a separate opening prayer. But that's just giving a prayer to the for the Congress, but to give a prayer to a joint prayer, that I don't think would be proper. But if people separately give the prayer to the Congress, not talking chas v'shalom at a ritual thing or at a rally, at one time they would open up a prayer. They would let's say when they would have a demonstration against aid to religious education. So there was a tendency to have a priest or a cardinal start off the session with a prayer. You understand? So if the prayer would be a religion, so under those circumstances, I would be very hesitant I would be against the Jewish people participating, Jewish organizations anyway, participating in it, because he comes across as the religious leader of the religious group, and that is the biggest problem that we're facing today. Because you can say what you want, but when we gather together, they're usually the spokesman, the religious spokesman.
Are we allowed to take world religion courses?
I think it depends on the nature of the course. It's better not to. But I think each case has to be asked individually. I certainly you should not take a course that the whole course is about the religion. In other words, I know people are going to point to the Kuzri. The Kuzri was written to talk about Judaism. They throw in a little bit about the other religions, but it wasn't to explain the other religions. It was to explain Judaism.
Is the issue of having double ring, wedding ceremonies, is that also because of Chukas HaGoyim or for different reasons?
My father felt that it was Chukas HaGoyim. And in case where it was all kinds of pressure to have a double ring ceremony, it sometimes affected the Shalom Bayis. So my father would say that the second ring should be given in the Yichud room. So not as part of the ceremony. He felt as part of the ceremony that was a ritual. It was seen as a ritual, and it was Chukas HaGoyim.